Thank you for watching Silver Lining for Learning on this 4th of July. Many of you may not have been able to make it, but thanks for watching here. Today, we are really spending the time reflecting among the host, what we've heard, what we've seen, what we observed, and both based on the episodes of guests, but also based on our observations, our reads, and our interactions about what's happening with COVID-19. So each one of us is going to say a few things, and then we're going to have a discussion. We'll be happy to take questions and or comments from the audience. So feel free to type and chat, and we're watching that as well. So thank you very much. I'm going to be the host and trying to be. So then I'm going to start with Chris.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate everybody coming. And those of you who are watching later, that's great as well. So when this started in mid-March, I think all of us had the expectation that we were going to do a short program that highlighted what was happening during an unusual disruption and that tried to persuade people when they were going back to normal, probably in the fall, that they shouldn't just do the same old stuff, but we should learn from this. And unfortunately, that assumption turns out to be really off target, that this is much worse in terms of its persistence and severity than anybody quite realized at that time, and that it's unclear when or even if we will ever get back to the pre-pandemic normal. And it's also pretty clear that we're going to be in a time of ambiguity, uncertainty, risk, sailing into the unknown for much longer than we might have thought early in March. So I'm kind of reframing my own thinking about this, that I'm now less worried about people going back too soon to just what they were doing before. And I'm now thinking that a lot of what we're trying to do is to highlight the different pieces that need to be part of some new model that's going to be part of the new reality that all of us face. So that's one reflection. And another reflection is that really, this is all underscored for me again, how important education is. And education of the kind that's not reflected in SAT scores, but rather reflected in a deep understanding of the world and the natural world and the social world and the biological world, and how all of those interact together. Because we see people who are highly educated in the sense that they get high grades, get high test scores, are part of elite universities, who are contributing to the problem because they don't understand, they haven't learned the most important things that education can communicate, which is how everything works together, rather than how you do well on a multiple choice item that's surrounded by distractors. And so that's sobering. And it helps to show the disconnect between a population that's capable of behaving wisely and rationally and a population that has a lot of people graduating from high school and a lot of people graduating from college, because those two are not as closely correlated as one might hope. History teaches us that, and now we're seeing that in the present. So that's another thought, is that I feel as if I'm in the right field, but only if we focus on the kinds of learning that help people in situations like this, as opposed to the kinds of learning that help people do well on psychometric measures. And in that spirit, I did post a new blog this week. You can find the posting on LinkedIn. It's about the erosion of high stakes tests and the fact that we need some kind of complementary measures. I'm not going to repeat the blog post here, but at the end, I say this is a unique time for investment because there's a lot of talent in assessment that's now freed up because the big testing companies are not doing well. And so there's this opportunity to take this human resource and apply it to this important problem if we're creative about it and if we're willing to invest. And I know that Silver Lining for Learning rightly focuses on bottom-up innovation, but I'm also concerned about top-down innovation. And particularly now that this isn't just surviving through some relatively short period of chaos before we get back to stability, particularly now that it's moving into a different kind of world and a different kind of future. There should be leadership from the top in the philanthropic organizations in particular that I'm just not seeing. I'm not seeing. They're busy putting Band-Aids on, people's wounds, which is important, and they're busy worrying about the erosion of their capital because the economy is going south, which I guess is important. But one of the lessons you learn in business school, which I haven't been to, but I've talked to people who have, is that the time to invest is when things are bad. That's when you can really buy on the cheap, if you will, and that's when you can really make substantial changes, which has been a theme in this program. And I'm just dismayed that we don't see that kind of leadership from the top. If we saw half of the leadership from the top that we're seeing from the bottom, I would be a lot more confident about where we were going with this. And if Warren Buffett wants to call me up after this show and say, okay, wise guy, here's a $10 billion, show me what you got, I'm on. I'm ready for it. The only other thought I want to put forward is about the moral and ethical nature of education. I've really been thinking a lot about this. I think that when I was young, I bought into the notion that education was really all about intellectual stuff. And in recent decades, there's been appropriately more and more emphasis on psychosocial and on motivational dimensions, which are very important as well. But we're still in a situation where education is really lacking on a moral and ethical level. Now, I understand about separation of church and state. I understand about not preaching a particular religion, but caring for other people as well as yourself, I think is fundamental to every religion. You're not taking a religious stance by saying that that's something that education should accomplish. And I don't think that we're seeing a happy outcome from saying, well, that's really the responsibility of the family, or that's really the responsibility of the community, or the religious institutions. School should just stay away from moral and ethical stuff, because what we're seeing is that if education is really good at intellectual gains, and it's really good at psychosocial gains, and it's really good at teaching people how to motivate others, and they're completely immoral, we're worse off than we were before. We're worse off than we were before. And I'm not sure how we navigate that very complicated territory, but somehow we've painted ourselves into a corner where I think that's really lacking. So for what it's worth, that's my 6 minutes of ruminations to kick off today.
Well, before I call the next I'm going to ask God. But I really want to chat with you, Chris, to expand on two questions. One is the large testing companies. Do you think they're gone or are they coming back?
I think that society will always want high stakes summative tests to handle the allocation of scarce resources. I think that we're going to go through a period where that's difficult in a way that it's difficult for many other aspects of education. But I do think that this is an opportunity where high stakes tests are weakened in terms of practicality at a time when there's also a lot of assessment talent, which tends to be pretty scarce as a resource available. And the confluence of those two things is exciting. And that's what I wrote the blog about.
Well, I was wondering if any of you guys have any comments on this issue about the what's going to happen. I know Shangye, China is going to launch its largest test next week, right?
Yes, yes. I think on the tests, this issue, I can share my observation from the China and also the Eastern nation. This is what we have already observed from the China. That is, although those midterm and final term examinations are almost canceled, yeah, especially for the lower grades, especially in the primary. However, in the upper primary and also in the secondary high school and also in the university, they still, maintained this kind of ritual of testing in almost major subjects. And that this major examination, just like our college entrance examination and also the secondary high school entrance examination, these two major examinations are firmly kept. And they are having, and I would call it as more like our cultural belief in the part of the education. That is, we have to have some kind of form of selection through this formal high stake examination. However, on the other side, we can see this, the test related, the PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder. We have already heard some cases and tragic cases of student suicides after the pandemic. Yeah, they are very extreme cases. For like they are just for like I will share the case from Shenzhen. Actually, they are not being publicized from official outlet. However, all the teachers and students know that is the local office of Shenzhen Education, they just canceled all the examinations of their schooling system, except that the high school, there's a high school entrance examination and college entrance examination, just because one case happened. That is, one student was caught cheating during the examination. So the teacher called out the student to talk a little about on the corridor, and the kid just jumped out. Yeah, they fell down and got himself killed. So this is very extreme case, but it make the whole system, all the testing canceled immediately. Yeah, and so we can see this something we need to more concerned about this maybe in this post-pandemic era. We can see this kind of differentiation of these two systems in a world. That is one still they cannot get rid of this examination or testing system. However, I can see just in the US, you are talking more about how can we do without this kind of examination system, especially in this college entrance selection. So I think this is the one. And the second that is I can share is about also just have this insights from the last 4 episodes. That is most of what we have known or in our formal schooling system, that we have this curriculum based on what we know. So we have this curriculum of knowledge that is we know. The society have already known. However, we have few approach or more theorizing from this curriculum of ignorance. But from the students shared in the last episode, we can see the students have already enjoyed this study, their own project from their own passion or ignited by their teachers. However, we can see that is from this pandemic period, we have a lot of knowledge or videos or a lot of knowledge they have to access from the online. But we, as kind of a formal institution to teach, we have very little experience in doing this ignorance. How can we let them do, or either we can do it as their like a pal, they have this kind of peer learning, or they have exploration of their own projects. However, we don't have a systematic understanding or exploration from our scholarship. That is, we can talk about this curriculum of ignorance. Yeah, this is my two things.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, because I was there's the other point about the big testing. I don't know what's going to happen in big testing. I hope we will never return, but some of them might return different ways. I was just wondering about the other point. It's called social emotional learning, and the non-cognitive, non-intellectual aspects of that. But I would just keep that point there. But let me approach Scott. You could address that, or you can just reflect something else. But that's another point I want to bring back later. Go ahead, Scott.
So I don't know if we ever really want to try and assess social, emotional, or psychosocial outcomes the way we do some of these low-level cognitive outcomes. What would a test look like for compassion, for example, or empathy? What would an assessment, a standardized assessment, look like for creativity or effective collaboration? I think we know ways to get at those, right? They look like portfolios and performance assessments and authentic tasks and real-world learning and defenses before experts and outside community members, but none of that is standardized. All of that is very contextualized. I would be very wary of a standardized assessment scheme, for example, around sort of psychosocial outcomes. So let me start there. I am thinking in different directions right now, because I was thinking while Chris was talking about, we didn't know where this Silver Lining for Learning initiative was going to go back when we started in late March. And we really did talk at the time. It would be a several-month thing. We would talk to some interesting people. We would wrap it up. And of course, we're just not there yet. I think what's in my head right now is that I look at the way some other countries are handling the pandemic, and then I look at the way the United States is handling it. I don't see any foreseeable future in which face-to-face school is going to be a viable enterprise in the fall in most places. I think we're fooling ourselves that kids and teachers are going to come back, even in a half and half staggered format, right? Because there's just too many people getting sick. I'm a huge baseball fan right now, and the instant they brought people back together for practice, and despite all of the, social distancing and health and cleansing guidelines that Major League Baseball has, players are dropping left and right within just a couple of days of arriving. And we're going to see the same thing happen this fall in school. We're going to see not just kids get sick, but numerous teachers and administrators. We're going to struggle to find subs and coverage. And so I see all these schools everywhere making plans about how the face-to-face format is going to be the primary modality. And then, yes, some kids will be at home until it's their turn to come to school. And it's kind of the secondary afterthought. And I think two big concerns around that. One is we're now asking teachers to do double design work. I'm going to design simultaneously for the kids who are in front of me at the moment in school, in my classroom, the half or third or whatever. And I'm also designing something virtual or remote or online for the rest of the students who are at home. And as we learned this spring, since most teachers have not been trained in robust online pedagogies, that's already takes more time than traditional face-to-face planning. Planning for face-to-face teaching and learning. And now we're asking them to do double, right? And I don't see that sort of crushing workload being alleviated right now for most teachers, because I don't think most school systems are ramping up the kind of training that teachers need to do really robust hybrid or high flex teaching and learning. So I think for most school systems, they're going to have to flip that. I think they're going to have to think of online as the primary modality, like we did this spring, only hopefully a lot better than we did this spring. And if we're lucky enough to get some kids face-to-face now and then, how do we use that in strategic ways for social emotional outcomes, for building community, for checking in with kids? But even when students are there, I think they're probably going to be working on the same kind of remote, blended, online stuff that the rest of the students are at home. Because otherwise, I don't see it working logistically. And I think, you know, we're already seeing schools struggle with a lack of resources and fewer resources this fall because of, you know, tax revenue concerns in governments. And now we're asking them to take on additional expense around cleaning. And I think as soon as bodies start dropping, right, teachers, subs, administrators, whatever, it's going to get really bad unless we have planned for online as the primary modality. So that's kind of what's
Scott, I want to follow up on that, because that's what I've been thinking as well. I've been looking a lot about. I think you're absolutely right. I don't think American schools will be able to return to school truly with exactly the same thing. The parents won't send their kids there, and teachers will get sick, you know, all kind of issues. Actually, that may even happen in many other countries. Even could happen in China, because we just don't know what's going to happen. So what would be your silver lining to build something? What would be an ideal situation you could build for that?
Yeah, I'm really struck by a couple of our guests that we've had this past round, right? The ones that really resonated the most were when Cecilia and Katie talked to us about these online peer-to-peer writing spaces, right? Where youth are getting
fan fiction mentoring, yeah.
Right, yep, and giving feedback to each other in coordination with adults. And then of course the student episode that we had that resonated with everybody, where even though students were in remote settings, they were still doing really interesting, powerful, robust work well beyond factual recall and procedural regurgitation. And the dialogues that I'm trying to have with school systems right now is around how do we design for higher engagement virtual learning in the fall? You know, because in the spring, we could get away with sending home digital worksheets and paper homework packets on backpacks on buses, because parents gave us the grace of the emergency situation. But now that we've had several months over the summer to get ready for next year, that's not going to last very long, that sort of grace and goodwill from our communities. So I think if we can get school systems to recognize that we can do higher engagement and more robust learning in virtual environments, that's going to be a huge silver lining, I think, in those systems, because they're going to recognize that our previous online efforts, which have been primarily around sort of digitizing low-level curriculum into chunks and turning them into adaptive software systems and learning management systems, we can do that more robust inquiry and project-based and student-centered learning. And there's ways to do that, right? And we've been hearing about some of those ways the past few weeks and the past few months. And so if that's a silver lining that emerges, I'm going to be absolutely delighted. But I think that, again, we're going to see early adopters sort of take the lead on that, and a lot of other people are going to struggle.
Thank you. Let me actually move down to Kurt. Kurt, what have you been thinking about? what has all of this, of course, you can refer back to Chris' comments and Shang-Ye's comments, Scott's comments, but Rain, what have you been over the past 5 weeks?
I've been reflecting on the fact that the show keeps getting better and better. I've been reflecting on the fact that our questions keep getting better and better from all of us. And that in turn, we're thinking about things that we hadn't thought about in episode 1, 2, and 3. And that's a good sign. And I see the possibilities for this to continue, to get us to think about who might build on what we've had the first 15 weeks. Who are some possibilities? Who are some guest possibilities? And what other things might we do with blogs and with side comments and with publications and other things that might enhance this even further? But I think we've gone a bit beyond. I think we've met our initial goals, and I think we've gone a step above them. We've had people volunteer. Some of the folks in the chat right now have been part of that, and I want to thank them, the people who showed up today and have inserted some questions for us to ask once we're through our reflections. So I think what's shown is that each of us has the connections out there that will enhance the show even further as we bring them in. And some of them overlap. I mean, it's really interesting to see the connections that we have that do overlap and some that don't. And I think we have to spend a little bit of time talking about that today, about where we want to go, what else we could do, or who else are possibilities to build on what we've had. But I'm going to stop there for a second. There's other things. I mean, one guy wrote me in my blog. He says, "Am I going to get a certificate for attendance?" Are we going to give away certificates for attendance? I don't think so, but maybe. What are some things that we could provide our audience, in effect, Silver Lining for Learning members in our show? We have a show like Saturday Night Live, but we're SLL instead of SNL. But I'm going to stop there and just say, Punya, we miss you. Punya is enjoying 4th of July and reflecting on this session. He's going to watch the episode later and put it up on the web. So thank Punya for that. And I'm going to state all my reflections from the standpoint of Punya starts with a P. And so as Chris was presenting P word, he was talking about populations that we're struggling to deal with in this COVID age. He was talking about his posts within the blog and what he's been attempting to do, and the fact that we're not addressing the psychosocial needs of our students adequately, and what can we do with philanthropic contributions and grants and so forth to address the student populations that has changed in the present. In the past, he had all sorts of P words. Shang-Ye had a few P words herself, and I like the one that pulled out of there was passion. I had listed a whole bunch of things when Chris was talking, I'll come to, and I had forgotten passion, so thank you. And she said in particular, P word, passion when peers are involved and the peer learning is involved. And I think that's important. She said, during this pandemic period, two P words she said in there. And another one that I'll make into a P word was exploration. She repeated several times. It's not exactly a P word, but those was, so peer-based learning, passionate learning, exploration were some of the principles, P word, that were underlying what she had to say. And Scott, and one other thing that Shang-Ye said was a student dying, a student committing suicide and passing away, another P word. Today, someone at Penn State died of COVID, and this is one thing I've been thinking about, Young, is what happens in the fall when one person dies? Are we going to switch it all up? Just at that point, everything's going to change? What's going to happen when we've had the one student die? Today it happened. What happens when 5, or God forbid, more than that, pass away from COVID, and might not even be related to showing up at school in a university or K-12 school? So it was as I said, a Penn State, another P word. Scott talked about performance assessments and psychosocial related outcomes, planning for face-to-face, yet the primary modality being online. He also, like Xiangye, talked about the importance of peer-to-peer feedback in these systems that produce powerful work, as he said. The papers may be being stuck in the backpacks for the current time. And the final P he mentioned was primarily digitizing the curriculum so that students find it useful. Chris, I already mentioned Chris Young. He's pulling out points. He's the P word for Young so far is pulling out the points out of us. But the P's that are important to me and what I've seen the past few weeks are personal control. And we saw that last week in particular, the students taking personal control and responsibility for their learning with the guidance of their instructors and the guidance and support, and their instructors in one case even showed up. I was wondering who that was in the Zoom. Did we have a Zoom bomber? But no, that was the instructor was there. It took me 10 minutes to figure out who. I was pretty worried for a while. But that guidance pushes people beyond their comfort levels a bit. It pushes them into new territory. And so I think about psychology, in particular developmental psychology of Piaget and Vygotsky. On the one hand, I'm seeing, Piaget was right in terms of getting students challenges, and they're rising above those challenges and solving those challenges. But in many ways, Vygotsky was right, and these kids were doing phenomenal things well beyond what I expect a 7th grader to do, well beyond what an 11th and 12th grader would be doing. They were doing, in some cases, advanced undergraduate research, maybe an undergraduate thesis or beginning master's level, doing, research in the communities and providing reports on them. So authentic problems. So authentic problems, problem-based learning, and the last 2 Ps being the possibilities to me after watching last week and even the week before. They went hand in hand in some ways, thinking about administrators and then going to students after that. The possibilities for progressive education were alive and well the last few weeks. Every week during the past 4-week sessions, we've had the possibilities of progressive education. So if there's anything we could do is create maybe a whole set of papers from us that each of us talks about the 5 Ps of the pandemic and what our principles of learning are, not only to help students survive, but to have them excel and to have them internalize some of the things that have happened so that when they find themselves in difficult situations again down the road, they'll be able to cope with and move and again, succeed in this new world. So I framed it from Punya's standpoint. Punya, I'm sure you'd have a better way of framing it than what I've done. Maybe you'll write a blog post on what we've all said in our reflections, and you'll be able to tie us all together, or maybe Young will tie us together. So that's where I'm at. Young.
Thanks, Kurt. And Xiangye, did you have something special you want to say before I come together to say something and responding to the audience? No? Well, I mean, I think, I have a few things I've been really thinking a lot about. One is to follow what Scott was talking about. What's the primary mode of learning? Whatever primary mode of learning happens next year, it's going to be, or next fall in about 2 months, is going to be, there's no consistency. That's one thing. So I've been thinking a lot about this. So I want to be brave enough, to challenge all of us listeners to think this way. Number one, if we're going to put in together online resources, why cannot teachers across districts, across countries, across states to co-create something? There's no need for a million of those resources to be up there and select, but so far I haven't seen that done, not even within school districts. Teachers teaching in multiple, in different schools, but within the same district, they're not even working together. That's one thing I think. First thing, can we rethink. I don't want anyone to organize us to do this. I just want people to bind together to think. People have different styles. Let's imagine we have 100 different styles of teaching. Can we have 100 just websites to capture all those things instead of trying to have millions of them or one or two of them? That's what the first thing I was thinking about. The second thing is probably more revolutionary. Without schooling, school time is all the time. If student right now, schooling is defined as the time students are in schools. But now students are distributed. They're everywhere. They don't have to come. So they're learning. The learning is all the time learning. So can we design learning not based on what you instruct, what you teach in a room, but based on what they can learn, what they want to learn, and like the students we have from last week, not trying to define your course, but define a learning experience. A third point, which is coming to me again within the pandemic coming, could we not undo the curriculum or redo the curriculum? I'm talking about undoing curriculum. It's really, I think right now we all know. I've been, because I'm working on the books. I've been interviewing a lot of people. Almost everybody says that the curriculum doesn't work, but everybody says it doesn't work. But why do we keep doing that and pretend that's the right thing we have to do? And so that's another thing. Why redoing the curriculum is that, can we not renegotiate with our students what they would like to learn, what they want to learn, but also importantly, with whom they can learn from? Like, Kate Davis, and remember that the big learning group, they really can learn with different people from different countries, different places. Can we rethink about how to legitimize learning? Which comes to the last point about assessment. Assessment, I think when Shuang Ye was talking about rituals, I saw that in our audience, we have a lot of people. I think Shady Laskin from Ontario is talking a lot about, and Maureen talk about rituals. But let's go beyond those rituals to say right now, we can have personalized learning. I think Chris is right. Large scale assessment may never go away. Somebody is going to rely on them, but I think their position is weakened. Again, I'm recalling the idea, talking about how learning has escaped schooling, testing has not. So if learning has escaped, can we reinvent assessment? Unless we as a profession honestly do something about assessment as alternatives, as new possibilities, I don't think the big organizations themselves are going to recreate. And I know like OECD, PISA is recreating a lot of new tests. I hope they don't come. They're creating the creativity test, for example. So those are the points I want to reflect on. And we have wonderful audiences that have been raising a lot of interesting discussions and questions. So I want to see, where do you think we can go? Chris, I want to come back to you.
Before Chris speaks, everyone should go to Chris' LinkedIn page. He's just published something on this assessment as a lead-in. Chris, you might go ahead.
Well, I really like where all of you are going, because what we're doing is we're looking at the invisible walls that we keep bumping into. Time in school, curriculum, and so on. And I want to talk about another kind of invisible wall, because I think 70% of the solution is framing the problem correctly. And the more we catch these invisible walls, the more likely we are to come up with a really powerful solution. So there is a lot of pressure for kids to go back to school, despite the dangers. And some of that pressure comes from fear that they're not getting educated if they're not in school, which is sometimes true and sometimes not. But there's another motive that's not really explicitly discussed, but that is there. And that is that school is a place that parents can put kids where so they're safe while the parent goes to work. And even if the parent is going to work in the office down the hall, as opposed to in the building 10 miles away, they still can't cope with doing full-time childcare, full-time child education, which is some of what happens when the school isn't doing a good job, as it gets dumped onto the parents, and being a productive part of the economy. Plus, there are a lot of parents who cannot work from home. The nature of their job means that they have to go into work, even though that involves substantial risks. And so the economic recovery, which is also very important for education, is tied up with somehow providing, if not school, some kind of secure way of keeping children engaged and safe. And again, we're not thinking very creatively about that. I was thinking about summer camp. Now, summer camps are not allowed in Massachusetts this summer, so I'm not talking about summer camps in the present, but I'm talking about the model of summer camps. The best counselors in summer camp are the kids who've been to camp for several years and they really love it, and now they're going to be the counselor. And that's a much better counselor than the adult that's 20 years older, that's just trying to keep the camp from exploding. And I brought up last week with these students the idea that there are students who could be the equivalent of camp counselors, even though they might, in some cases, be younger students. Students who are clearly get it in terms of powerful ways of learning, students who are highly motivated, students who can engage others and get them excited. Now, do I want to take their childhood away and turn them into teachers? No. But I do think that there are ways that we could rely on a much, much larger population of kids who can excite other kids than we have, frankly, teachers or parents who can excite kids. And that's another way of thinking about this issue of how we provide some degree of keeping kids busy and happy and learning without the parent having to provide most of the structure. So just a thought about another item that's part of the mix, I think, in terms of solution.
Yeah, I think what Chris was saying, one point I want to really highlight a lot is kids learning from each other, kids tutoring each other, kids learning by helping others. That's where we get a lot of social emotional stuff too, that kids helping others, working with others. I think this is, honestly, we have come to a time, really because of technology, in many different places, children can participate in a traditional work for a long time. I just want to highlight a little bit of that, Chris, because you may not have grown up on a farm in China. You know, I grew up in a tiny village in a very remote area. I was helping the family as soon as I could. Maybe 2 or 3 year olds, we go harvest stuff for the pigs, for the water buffalo. So we were participating in economical activities in the villages. I have been thinking a lot about the kids today actually are participating, can participate in a digital economy in some way, but we are not allowing them to do that. We're still thinking about age 18, so you can work in the factory, you can go to the factory, but technically we're not. So I'm not taking a risk. I might offend some of you. I'm trying to redefine childhood. You know, really think about childhood. You actually, children can not only helping others, they do produce economic commodities, you know, to those children. And so that's another way to think about, okay, so don't hate me too much, you know, but anyway, I want to ask Scott, Shangye, and Kurt, you won't have anything to respond to? Or should we chat about some questions? I have not been reading the questions.
Yeah, so I'll respond with this idea that I think one of the things that most of us as hosts believe in is this idea of students as drivers of their own learning in some way, shape, or form. But as we know, systems of education are inherently political, right? In terms of how they're structured, how they operate, the decisions that they make, what they choose to emphasize and not emphasize. And so it's actually a very political act to talk about liberating students as owners of their own learning, right? Particularly here in America, where we have long thought of the purpose of education and schooling as a socializing structure where we teach kids the stuff that we want them to know, and we socialize them into the norms and behaviors of American society, whatever those are, right? And I think what we're hearing right now, particularly from our young people who are absolutely fed up with a number of societal and governmental structures, is that they have had quite enough, right? And they are speaking out against whatever the latest injustices and inequities they see in that system. And so I wonder if we can seize the political moment that's happening outside of school around inequities and injustice and empowerment, and somehow turn those into conversations within schools around student liberation and empowerment and agency and voice. I hope so.
Well,
but of course the system will push back hard against any attempts to change it. So, but it feels like we have a window of opportunity here in a long-term model of punctuated equilibrium of change, right? Where change happens in short bursts and then pauses for a while, then moves forward again and then pauses for a while or pushes back. So it feels like we have this window of opportunity right now to have some conversations that we couldn't have had maybe even just a year ago.
well, Scott, I think I would just like to amend to that. I doubt we can make the politics stop. And but I think education is the one that's going to change. You know, despite all the debates, the fights by adults at the school board meetings, you know, curriculum meetings, all of those things, you actually be surprised to see how pretentious, or maybe I shouldn't use that word, but how kids pretend to comply. It's actually surprising. If you go to schools right now, teachers seem to have a great control of the kids. They may or may not actually do, but you know, if your kids come to school, you know, may come from different political place, but they come to school, they all follow the same thing. So that's quite, so what I think Abraham Lincoln was talking about, the philosophy of the classroom today is the philosophy of the government tomorrow. So I have to remember all those things that, you know, we need to influence our kids. I think educators, teachers are probably in the best place, right? Don't you think? I think we need to use the opportunity to drive that, at least up to maybe 3rd or 4th grade. Children in our schools are quite compliant. they really, they love to hang out with teachers, love to learn that. So how do we drive that? I think that's another point I was just going to highlight. I think we need to do a lot more to focus on the moral, the ethical, the social, and the emotional. I think for the past maybe 3 decades, would you say, many countries have been overly focusing on the cognitive. Look at the standardized testings on math, on reading. All the OECD's PISA is nothing, has nothing to do with about being together, living together. It's about global competitiveness. I've always hated the term global competitiveness. You can't compete globally unless you work together. But anyway, that's really my point. So, but thanks, Scott. And Kurt and Shangye, do you guys want to jump in?
Shangye, you want to go first, or you? Okay, I just saw Melissa's post there, and she's talking about this emotional need in building relationships among teachers and students, and what can be done in an online space to provide that, to build relationships. And I provided a link for her to the Indiana Youth Institute, which is going to offer 2 sessions, both repeated, July 28th and August 3rd. They're free. So Melissa, if you want to jump in there and sign up for a register, anyone who's watching in the chat, So I'll be in both days at 1 o'clock Eastern talking about that, but there'll be many others much more knowledgeable than I am. So try and attend the whole day. So I'm sure more such things will spring up. It's really critical that this happens now in July and in August before we step back in September and find ourselves back home again with the students and not having a plan or not having confidence or some self-efficacy of oneself as an online instructor or as an online learner or blended one. So I think now is a time to build up some small wins, some successes, some connections that one has, some places to go to talk to others, some communities, some networks. I think we could build up teaching and learning communities now in the summer that could spring from the Indiana Youth Institute and other such events. It's not just these one-off events that are important, it's what happens after them. It's what happens before them. It's the communities of instructors, of teachers and learners, where they are sharing. And by the way, this is not a new thing. I mean, for a couple of decades now, there's been communities of teachers, be it in Korea, in the US, in Spain, and other places that, you know, Chris and your students and my students have been doing dissertations on this for a long time. So this principles around building these online communities of teachers have been pulled at, been explored, and people have made attempts to understand. Now we need to implement what we've been researching for a couple of decades. It's now time for us to take the best practices of what we found out, to under the principles, the connections, to build that social and emotional context for the safe harbors for learning, as Maslow might have talked about, or Carl Rogers or others. We need to build those safe harbors, and then we'll see some successes that we hadn't seen in the spring. We'll see them in the fall. Or at least I hope so. So Melissa, I hope you sign up. And if you do, let me know. Send me an email. Let me know how it goes, or anyone else. That's what I have to say.
So Kurt, that's very interesting. I think, you know, I just want to add to, again, another piece to that is that the building online communities have been going on for a long time, even before the true internet happened. You know,
Right.
people have been studying this for a long, long time. Actually, we just, so I think this is, what's unfortunate is that I don't see a lot of practices through all this research being put in place, being examined. I think that's another area I want to encourage all our listeners or people who you may come in touch with. It is actually useful to read some of the research that has happened, and you can search for that. There's some, you know, not so good research, but some good research. So I want to bring Shuang-Ye, you as a publisher of a journal. You want to observe from a journal perspective. What have you seen?
Excuse me. Yeah. Could you repeat it again?
I say from a
repeat?
journal perspective. You know, you've been supporting us. You're helping us think about this issue. You know, out of all these episodes, what do you think from a research perspective? You could see, because all of us are writers. You know, all of us are researchers. We're all from universities. So you've seen the research side. You've seen, we talk to kids, we talk to other people. What's your reflection?
From the journal perspective?
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, I'm also struggling with figuring out there is any issues or how to say what we're mostly interested in, and think we have already published several commentaries from the point of views of a scholar's point of view. But however, this, if we will need more from this kind of reflection and imagination from this pandemic, just as our the name of this episode, that is silver lining, and since we are still exploring or navigating, just as this group. I'm thinking that maybe we can do more with this reflection on, or bring out more conversations on this new normals. Where would that new normal head on? That at least from my experience in China now, that is, I don't see quite distinctive new normal from the previous. And all the testing or major testings are going on, and our schools back to the normal. So maybe there is a kind of a 2 or 3, I would say, not educational system, but the educational regimes in the world, based on their own cultural context and the civilization. Just as Professor Zhao pointed out, maybe in America, people would believe the teacher could be the power leverage, they can leverage the revolution. But then maybe in the other civilizations, they will still be, would like to heritage. They have this kind of a mission of cultural heritage, consciously or unconsciously, they will still carry on. So I think this may be more, we will be more interested in this kind of global change. And also, I would like this, Chris point out this kind of invisible laws, and what would be this would be the chance to explore those invisible laws, in which the pandemic would bring to us. Yes.
Thank you. So I want to say a few words, and then Scott is going to announce about next week's. Really, first of all, I want to really acknowledge that the school we had before the pandemic have problems. So that's the first issue. So that is, I think that's sometimes we forget. It's like as if because of pandemic, we're trying to change schools. Schools were supposed to be changed or should have been changed a long time ago. So that's the first point I want to say. There are many problems. And now suddenly when schools are forced to close, we'll say, let's go back. I think China is a good example to say, let's go back to our school. Let's go back to our school. And it succeeded going back to school, but Beijing suddenly shut all schools down, because, have several hundred cases. So so this first acknowledge it. We had the problems. We did not have a perfect schooling system. When we want to return to the old school as if that's the new normal, that's not a new normal. That's an old normal. It's not even normal. So that's, I think, first thing we all recognize. That's really important to understand. The second thing is that the pandemic is just a good opportunity to do something about that horrible situation. Again, from my interviews recently with a lot of people says, well, how many schools are actually doing innovative things? I would bet you less than 10%. If you go around schools, less than 10% of schools anywhere is doing genuinely innovative things to transform itself. Another point I want to say, okay, changes today, I've seen a lot of works done, like instructional coaches, instructors are done at the curriculum, the student, but most of them are not at the fundamental level student autonomy and student agency, that today's children are very different from children before. They have more access to knowledge, more access to others. So I'm just going to throw this thing out to everybody. Then Scott, you can announce this thing. Do you think it's possible, Chris, Kurt, Scott, Shang-Yi, and everybody in the audience, you don't have to answer the question, that if schools, public schools, were allowed to enroll students from anywhere online. Let's imagine schools are not going back to traditional school. What would that happen? If we have so many schools, America has, 10,000, tens of thousands of schools. If one school, like 100 schools, they do better. And the students can bring their money, come in there. I'm not advocating that as a policy. Okay, this can be very confusing. But if that could happen, what would it be like? How would that be happening? I don't know. Scott, it's yours. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Scott.
Thanks, Tom. So one of the things that has really excited me about the development of learning technologies over the last decade or so is that we have seen rapid growth in the capacity of devices and online environments and internet bandwidth and so on to handle really complex multimedia. And what that has allowed us to do is that we are starting to see sort of these real world but simulated environments emerge in which we can immerse educators and students into real world contexts. And we're seeing simulations take off in the business world, for example, as a substitute for decontextualized, workshop training. And so Chris and I have put together a double two sets of episodes on simulations, which we're really excited about. So next week will be our simulation on Sunday at the same time, not Saturday, Sunday next week, where we'll be talking about simulations for educators and professional learning. And Ken Spiro, who's the CEO of School Sims, and Sarah Dexter, who studies simulations at the University of Virginia, will be joining us for that conversation. And then a few weeks later, Chris will lead an episode on simulations and gaming oriented more on the student side of things. So I hope you join us next week for educator and professional simulations and the possibility of those. And thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. Thank you.